So why do some stories repeat themselves over the centuries while others are forgotten about? Today we're going to look at the famous story of the Ride of Lady Godiva of Coventry. It's a story that's over 900 years old, and it evolved over the centuries to demonstrate something that I'm calling psychological resonance, the idea that some stories are stickier than others. So psychological resonance is a quality of either a story or a symbol, and it's a characteristic that I developed when I was studying mythology and folklore. I continue to study these things, but when I started writing about this is when I came up with this idea. And you can think of it as a quality that a story, say, has in terms of its stickiness, mental stickiness. Like, how easy is it to remember? How likely is it that people are going to want to hear it again? And there's a bunch of examples of this around the world, of stories that have a very high level of psychological resonance. And that would be any story that you see either independently invented across the globe, or a story that's told over and over again across the centuries in a particular culture. Because only those most resonant stories are going to be the ones that get told rather than forgotten about. Because psychological resonance, by definition, means that it's easy to remember. So, for example, Beauty and the Beast type stories that have the structure of Beauty and the Beast, are found in nearly every culture studied. Cinderella is another example of this. The Smith and the Devil. I've talked about a couple of these on the channel here. The Smith and the Devil, for example, in the Indo-European versions of this story, there are some scholars that think that story is literally thousands of years old. Beauty and the Beast the same way. So there's something about these stories that just grabs the human imagination and it won't let go. And people want to hear this type of story again and again and again. And now remember, in folklore studies, we're mainly looking at oral transmission. So that sets up a particular set of problems, meaning that if it's told through an oral tradition, well, it's not written down, and so you don't just get people copying it over and over again. So the memory factor is super important in that case. That's why these stories are so interesting from a psychological point of view, because only those universal characteristics of the mind that particular story appeals to are going to really contribute to the resonance of a particular story. Said in another way, some stories appeal to these universal facilities, whatever they are, or faculties, and so then they bear repeating. They grab the imagination, they evoke the emotion, and that's how it works. So the example I want to give today is it's a story that arose of Lady Godiva of Coventry. She lived around the 11th to 12th century, somewhere around that time. And she was an actual person who lived in Coventry. She was a noble, and that's in England, by the way, if you don't know. And so the story goes that the very earliest versions of the story that we have here are that she was very popular in her little area of Coventry, but her husband wasn't so popular because he was advocating for this difficult tax, this tax that the populace didn't like. And she, being an advocate for her subjects, went to her husband and said, could you, remit this tax? Could you give them a break? And as the story goes, her husband said, if you ride through town naked, I'll get rid of this tax. And so she did. And in the earliest versions of this story, which were written about 100 years after her death by monks, no one saw her, and it was a miracle. And so when she came back home, he had to agree. And so that's the early version of the story. All right, so already we have a story that's pretty evocative. It's pretty, emotionally engaging. It's got a twist, it's got nobody saw her. Oh, it was a miracle. just riding through naked, so that's going to be, interesting to people for that reason, because, there's embarrassment and there's shame and there's the social status, someone who's a noble, all that sort of thing. But that's not the end of the story, meaning that the interesting thing about this particular story is that we have multiple versions of it across the centuries. We have the early ones that I said. Then you fast forward a couple hundred years, and we have later versions of the story that are different. Oh, how are they different? This is the thing that's really, I think, fascinating about this stuff, because with each version of the story, of course, many of them are told through oral tradition. Well, of course, any particular storyteller is going to give the story their unique spin. They're going to add things here, maybe subtract things there, but it's only the most resonant stuff that's going to stay forever, or at least for a long time. So then this process works like natural selection in evolution. The traits that give a particular animal survivability are the ones that continue to persist, and the ones that don't get weeded out. Same thing for stories that are told over and over again. Elements that are added that are resonant will stick to the story, and then subsequent storytellers will tell it with that piece added. And you see this in the story of Lady Godiva. A later version of the story, she rode through town naked, and instead of saying that it was just a miracle that nobody saw her, it was the love of the populace for her. Everyone chose to close their windows and not look. And so that piece was added later to the story. Apparently, that's a little more resonant, So, fast forward another couple of hundred years now. And you've got the same story, and they include the bit about the populace choosing not to look in this later version. So that must have been pretty resonant, rather than just being a miracle. That wasn't as resonant as the later version. Only this time, in the later edition of the story, there was one person who chose to look anyway. And when he did this, the horse neighed, calling attention to him, and he was shamed. Everybody looked and it's like, oh, come on, dude. So that piece that was added about the populace had a wrinkle added that stuck, okay? Because, again, another couple of hundred years, and you have another version of this where you have the guy who chose to look, only in the even later versions, he actually goes blind, and he's given a profession too. He's a tailor, and with each iteration here, they add a little bit more to it. Now, who knows what was added to it that was forgotten about? Nobody knows, because it was forgotten about. So all we know is that, but we know that because of the way this process works, only the stuff that was continually told and remembered and loved about the story stuck. So now what many of you may have heard of the phrase, the peeping Tom. Well, that's where that comes from, is the name of the tailor was decided at some point that it was Tom. And Tom looked at Lady Godiva and he went blind. Now, some folklorists who have looked at this story have noted that the further along you go, the more fairy tale-like the story seems to get. Magically going blind is something that you see in a lot of really old fairy tales where mortals are looking upon the gods, or they're looking at the fairies, or whatever kind of land spirit creatures, and if they're not supposed to, they can go blind. And so somehow that piece got added to this. There's also some themes that folklorists have noticed that are in this story too, that you often find in fairy tales as well, which would be a female protagonist having to do something that is embarrassing, like disrobing and all that sort of thing, of a sexual nature, in European folktales anyway, and that being part of a plot point. Or another element is the female outwitting the male, who sets upon them a task that's impossible to do, and yet they do it anyway. So that's another one of those fairy tale twists. So all of this stuff got piled onto the story of the Lady Godiva of Coventry, and is a really good example of what I'm talking about when I get into the subject of psychological resonance. The more resonant a story is, the more memorable it is, the more impactful it is, and I think the more persuasive it can be. Because how I apply this theory to individual psychology is that I note that when a person starts therapy with me, or any therapist really, they have their own little narrative of their life, and sometimes it's a jumbled mess that's not very resonant. It's hard to make sense of. It feels chaotic and scary. It can. And through the process of therapy, we forge together a new story. And we're not making stuff up. We're making sense of what happened. And that's extremely important. There's a huge amount of anxiety that's created in the human psyche by not understanding what happened or why. If I can't make a story out of it, I can't make sense of it, it's extremely unsettling. It makes you feel unsafe. It can cause all sorts of anxiety and depression and so forth. So that's one of the, I think, common elements to all types of therapy is that you do this. You go through this process. But the wrinkle I'm adding to this, though, is that through the study of folk tales and mythology, you start to see the pieces of it that stick and they're most powerful, and those are the resonant elements. So just kind of looking over in general here then, you can say that psychological resonance is a quality that narratives and symbols have that measure its stickiness over time or memorability, and that this characteristic gives us clues as to our innate ways of thinking about things. It taps into the most universal and emotionally powerful ways that we put stories together. And in fact, I think that every human psyche coming into the world eventually starts to develop its own alphabet of symbolism that is innate. And these different symbolic elements that I talk about in some of my other videos find their way into narratives. Things like light and dark being equated with knowledge and truth and security versus danger or the unknown, or fear and that sort of unsafe. That kind of thing weaves itself into things that become resonant as a result. Because we all have these powerful ways of thinking symbolically, it finds its way into the way that we tell stories. So when you're out there taking a look at stories, and just to have a thought about this, like why is this story told over and over again? Now this is different from jokes, right? So jokes, for example, will spread like wildfire, but then they kind of fizzle out. Okay, that's sort of like resonance, but not quite, because resonance means I want to hear the story over and over again. All of us have either memories, or we know children who get really attached to a particular kind of story. They want to hear it over and over again. Now, as a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you might want to think about, I wonder why that story speaks to that person. And that's a great question to ask. Thanks for watching.